So we want to start with, so why NoSQL? In the beginning, God created the database, and it was good. Relational databases have been the norm for as long as we can remember, and this goes back to the mainframe days and certainly to the underpinnings of the web. And they're old, and they will be around forever, if only for legacy systems, if nothing else. But that world of Oracle and MySQL and PostgreSQL and Microsoft, SQL Server is starting to go away. The pros, obviously, is that there's integrity and there's a sequential nature, and hey, everybody supports it, and this has been around forever. But it can get expensive, and as we're seeing with a lot of web applications, especially when we talk about real-time data and we talk about wanting to deliver things on a number of platforms and really deliver services that can go up and down in scale, it becomes really difficult to do. So as we say here, the scale up is typically not out. So yeah, you can always add more databases, but it's really difficult to be able to add more breadth to what you're doing. And that gives us to this whole new world of databases, and that's basically what we're talking about tonight. And it's kind of amazing that in the last 5 years, but I would say really probably the last 2 or 3 years, that we've been able to see kind of a new definition of what the database can be, and it's coming into its own. So NoSQL is loosely defined as the next generation database that are very decidedly non-relational, and they're non-relational in every aspect, from the architecture to the APIs, even for support for things like asset transactions and schema capabilities, and they're available across platforms, which is a really big deal, and it's especially a big deal when we're talking about web services and things that are facing the consumer web rather than a lot of the older school database products, which were built for in maybe very large single customers, but were basically single customer facing entities. And NoSQL has a great ring to it, right? So Carlo Strozzi, who's considered kind of the godfather of the movement, he used it to describe a non-relational database setup, and it's kind of stuck around to describe things that's kind of a whole emerging class of distributed database systems. And we're not really sure why it's called NoSQL instead of like NoRel, but NoSQL's a lot more catchy, and I think that it's one of those things that kind of highlights a lot of people's frustrations, especially with kind of the growing emergence of new technologies with the older technologies. So kind of having that NoSQL in there is great. Coincidentally, there is also kind of a counter movement that I've called the SoSQL movement of people who are trying to convince us all that the SQL can scale and to ignore all this new technology. But I'm sure that's something that a lot of people on the panel will kind of disagree with and say that the SoSQL people should get on the train already and join the future. But given the maturity of today's open source and commercial relational databases, the big question is, so why do we need a new kind of database? Well, what kinds of NoSQL databases are out there, and do they all follow the same architectural guidelines, and what's motivated by these new databases, and what can they do for us? How can they make you money? How can they make your business better? How can they make your product better? And is this trendy, or is this a wave of the future? And I think that's a big question, and that's certainly something that becomes a really important thing to consider anytime we're talking about these newer technologies. Old school SQL has been around for a long time, and it's kind of proven its worth. So what is the real value in moving to this newer technology? Does this need standardization, or is the fact that it's unstandardized and kind of having a bunch of different flavors, is that a benefit for the movement as a whole? And when you're using NoSQL, what are you using it for, and what can you use it for? What is it not good for? There are situations that are not adroit to be using NoSQL systems. So if you're choosing NoSQL, what should you pick? What solutions do you pick? And I think that's why this is great. We've got people both from the product side and from the solution side who can kind of duke it out, so to speak, over what solutions work best. And what are the various trade-offs between the various solutions? So what we're kind of going to get to, I think, today, and something that when I spoke with some of these guys on the phone earlier this week, is that a lot of high-profile web properties in enterprise settings have already moved to NoSQL in mass or in part. They're already moving in that direction. And that's a really important thing to take in mind. But I think it's also important to question, well, is this a new trend, or are a lot of these companies just doing things that are object databases with relaxed constraints. And after talking to a lot of these guys, I think that it's clear that a lot of their businesses rely fundamentally on things that take place in the NoSQL world. So it's certainly not just an object database. It's something more than that. But we're going to get into kind of why NoSQL and what that means. So why NoSQL? Well, you have a huge volume of content, and this is something that we're facing on the web with increasing. It's coming at us all the time. There's real-time content. People are producing more content. People are retrieving more content, and people are expecting to have access to more content all the time. So if you have a huge volume of content like Foursquare, where you have check-in information and database location information from thousands of different places all over the world, and you have millions of different users, that's something that really needs to be taken into consideration, and that's something that can bring a traditional database to its knees. Distributed infrastructure is another part of this. Instead of having to have something that's just coming from a central source, having a distributed database structure makes a lot of sense, so that the load can be sent out to multiple parts, and it can be served better to end users, and the product ultimately can be a lot more successful. The big thing too is relaxed and agile. The nature of web applications is different than enterprise apps or older school software applications. It's not about working on a product until it's just perfect. Kind of like today Mac OS 10 Lion was released, and that by Apple standards might have been a more agile release, but it was still in the works for a long time. What we see with web software and web applications, whether it's enterprise or consumer facing, is that it needs to be changed on the fly. It needs to be updated frequently, and it needs to be modified to fit whatever the needs of the user are, and not wait for a more specific release cycle. And then obviously, the big thing is that throwing the big relational database rules out the window. And I think that's something that a lot of people have had a hard time with, is relational database rules can really constrain people into what they can and can't do. And that's probably one of the single biggest advantages in going into the non-relational database space and getting to NoSQL in general. It speeds up development, and you're not going to need a DBA. And then, as I was saying before, you can scale out rather than up. So if you need more breadth rather than just more servers, you can do that. And if you need to scale back, you can do that as well, rather than having to just have a bunch of idle servers running or idle databases that aren't doing anything. You can really customize your stack for what your own needs are. And that leads to major cost savings, because if machines aren't in use and power cycles aren't taking place, then you're not paying for it. You're paying for what you use, and you're paying for it as it needs to be used, so it's there for you to expand, but it doesn't necessarily have to be there if you're not using it. So the various platforms that are taking place in the NoSQL world right now, which I do enjoy that the platform choose. There's Cassandra, there's CouchDB, there's Membase, and MongoDB. And so we've got representatives from all of these here tonight who are going to talk about their various pluses and minuses and why theirs is better than the other. And tonight, we're talking to a bunch of companies who are actually using NoSQL in their own business. So Gilt Group, Foursquare, and Constant Contact. And I think this is the really important part, because it's one thing to hear about what these tools can do and what this technology is capable of, but it's different when you can see it actually in practice. And how are these companies, these real companies that are front-facing, how are they using the technology, and what is it enabling them to do? Speaking with some of them, some of these companies have migrated from more traditional database structures to NoSQL structures, and I think that's something that's really fascinating. Why make the move, and what are the benefits, and what are the downsides of making that sort of move?